Why did the goddess of love have to walk naked and powerless into the kingdom of the dead? What secret about the very source of life was hidden in that darkness, a secret so potent that even the gods of ancient Sumer feared it? On clay tablets unearthed from the dust of Uruk, priests recorded hymns to deities of order, but beside them, archaeologists find meticulous descriptions of sacred orgies, a paradox baked into the very dawn of civilization. Before humanity ever conceived of a king, it bowed to an unseen force, a fire in the blood that created life and, in its rage, could just as easily destroy it. This force had no name, but it had 1,000 faces, the swollen belly of a pregnant woman, the terrifying roar of a lion in the night, the spring flood that nourished the earth and drowned the careless. To survive, early humans did not try to understand this power. They tried to bargain with it. They danced. They bled. They offered sacrifices, not just of grain and animals, but of themselves. In the sprawling temple complexes of Mesopotamia, under the gaze of stone-faced idols, sex was not a private act. It was a cosmic duty. A young woman, for a price or for a vow, would give her body to a stranger not for pleasure, not for love, but to honor Inanna, the goddess who held the fate of the harvest in her hands. Each union was a prayer, an echo of the divine marriage that made the world fertile. It was a transaction with the gods, a desperate attempt to ensure the sun would rise again. These were not the sordid back-alley dealings of a later age. This was high ritual performed by the daughters of respected families, a service that brought honor, not shame. The force was too vast, too dangerous to be left to chance. It had to be channeled, directed, and appeased through the holiest of vessels, the human body. And what of the kings? In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a ruler, he was the nation's virility incarnate. His sexual potency was directly linked to the flooding of the Nile. If the river ran low, whispers would slither through the palace corridors. Was the god-king failing? His life was a continuous performance of power, and that power was fundamentally sexual. The reliefs on temple walls do not just show him smiting enemies, they show him as a bull, a potent symbol of masculine strength, surrounded by his many wives and concubines. The royal harem was not a den of pleasure, it was a political and spiritual engine. Through his unions, the pharaoh wove a web of alliances and reaffirmed his divine connection to the creative forces of the universe. An impotent king was a cosmic catastrophe, an invitation for drought, famine, and chaos to swallow the kingdom whole. This wasn't about morality, it was about survival. Dynasties rose and fell not just on the strength of their armies, but on the perceived vigor of their king's seed. The fate of millions rested between the royal sheets. But could such a raw, untamed power, even one deified and worshipped, remain unchecked forever? Even in a world of ritual, human passions, jealousy, ambition, rage festered. A slighted concubine, a rival brother, a priest with his own designs on power, the very force that guaranteed life could also become the perfect weapon. Wars were fought not for territory but for a single beautiful woman, like Helen of a later, more famous tale. Palace coups were launched on the whispers of an illegitimate child. Before humanity wrote laws for itself, it wrote prayers to the forces that ruled its blood. The chaos could not last. As villages swelled into cities and cities into empires, the wild, unpredictable energy of ritualized sex became a threat to the new creed of order. The gods of fertility were slowly pushed aside by the gods of the state, deities of war, justice, and bureaucracy. A new kind of man was taking power, the lawgiver. In Babylon, around 1750 before Common Era, King Hammurabi erected a towering stone stele, carving upon it 282 laws that would echo through eternity. And among the laws governing property, trade, and theft, he laid down the first comprehensive legal framework for sex. For the very first time in recorded history, an act that had been a conversation with the gods became a crime against the state. The transition was seismic. Adultery was no longer a personal betrayal to be settled by a duel, or a family feud. It was a public offense, meticulously detailed and brutally punished. If the wife of a man has been caught lying with another man, the code declared, they shall bind them and throw them into the water. The state, not the gods, now claimed ownership of a woman's body. Her fidelity was no longer a matter of honor, but a cornerstone of property law, ensuring that a man's inheritance would pass to his legitimate heirs. The sacred prostitute of the temple began to look like a threat to this new, rigid order. The passionate chaos of the fertility rite was anathema to the cold logic of the state. Hammurabi's code was not about morality in a modern sense, it was about control. It was a recognition that this primal fire, if left untended, could burn down the entire patriarchal structure a king had so carefully built. Empires were built on aqueducts and legions, but they crumbled because of a single careless affair in the imperial bedroom. The first tyrant was not the man who raised the largest army, but the one who first dared to legislate the bedroom. He sought to put a chain on chaos, but in doing so, he forged a new kind of cage. What would you choose, a world of sacred chaos where everything is permitted but nothing is safe, or a world of strict laws where everything is clear but there is no freedom? That first great law was a wall built against the storm of human instinct, but a wall is also a prison. So the first law was written. What do you think drove its creator more, a genuine desire for order or the fear of a powerful woman? Tell us in the comments. The law once written could not be unwritten. It spread like a crack in stone from the dusty plains of Mesopotamia to the sun-drenched shores of the Aegean. In Greece, the concept of law was elevated from a king's decree to a philosophical pursuit. Here, men in white robes would gather in the agora to debate the nature of justice, virtue, and the ideal state. They spoke of logic, reason, and control over the baser instincts. Yet, for all their soaring rhetoric, their world was built on a foundation of sexual hypocrisy so profound it would have made Hammurabi blush. The Athenians celebrated male love, particularly between an older man and a youth, as the highest form of connection, a path to intellectual and spiritual enlightenment. Plato wrote of it in his dialogues. Warriors of the sacred band of Thebes fought and died side by side with their lovers. This, they argued, was a love untainted by the messy business of procreation, a pure meeting of minds. But where were the women in this enlightened society? They were locked away in the gynoeceum, the women's quarters, unseen and unheard. A respectable Athenian wife's purpose was singular, to produce a legitimate male heir to inherit the family property. Her virtue was paramount, her movements restricted, her mind considered incapable of understanding the lofty concepts her husband debated in public. Her world was the loom and the nursery, while he sought intellectual companionship and physical pleasure elsewhere. The ultimate paradox of Athens was that its democracy, its philosophy, its very concept of freedom was exclusively for men. For half its population, the City of Reason was a beautifully decorated prison. They celebrated the male form in flawless marble sculptures, but the female body, unless it belonged to a goddess or a prostitute, was a source of anxiety, a potential gateway to chaos that had to be rigorously policed. The same man who could eloquently discourse on the soul's immortality would go home and expect his uneducated 15-year-old wife to be a silent, obedient vessel for his legacy. The philosophical ideal was a beautiful mask, and behind it, the old fears of female power and sexual disorder still reigned. Then came Rome. If Greece was a society of ideas, Rome was a society of brutal, pragmatic action. The Romans adopted Greek philosophy and art, but they infused it with their own relentless drive for power, order, and conquest. In the early days of the Republic, Roman morality was legendarily strict. The concept of gravitas, a solemn sense of duty, governed public and private life. The Roman matron, like her Athenian counterpart, was expected to be a model of chastity and loyalty, the anchor of the family. Stories of virtuous women like Lucretia, who killed herself after being raped to protect her family's honor, were held up as the ultimate ideal. But as the Republic expanded into an empire, staggering wealth and an endless supply of slaves flooded into the capital. The old virtues began to fray. The facade of stern morality remained, but behind the closed doors of patrician villas, a different world emerged. While laws against adultery remained on the books, punishable by exile or death, the ruling class indulged in excesses that would become legendary. Emperors like Caligula and Nero did not just have affairs, they staged them as public spectacles, turning the imperial palace into a theatre of debauchery. Orgies were no longer whispered rumors, they were state-sponsored events of breathtaking scale and cruelty. The hypocrisy was staggering. A senator who delivered a passionate speech about restoring traditional family values might spend his evening at a lavish banquet where sexual acts were part of the entertainment. Rome taught the world how to build empires, but its emperors taught it how to fall with exquisite debauchery. This wasn't just personal vice, it was a political symptom. The relentless pursuit of pleasure, the flagrant disregard for the very laws they imposed on others, was a sign of an elite that had lost its purpose, an empire rotting from the head down. The sacred rituals of the Bacchanalia, once rural fertility festivals, morphed into clandestine gatherings in the city where wine, ecstatic dancing, and sexual freedom attracted thousands. The Senate saw this not as religious expression but as a conspiracy, a threat to public order. In 186 before Common Era, they issued a decree that brutally suppressed the cult. Legions were sent not against a foreign enemy, but against their own citizens. Thousands were executed. The state feared any passion it could not control, any gathering it did not sanction. The personal became political, and the bedroom became a battlefield for the soul of Rome. This internal rot was mirrored in the vast institution of slavery that powered the empire. For a Roman citizen, sexual ethics were a complex web of duties and prohibitions. For a slave, there were no ethics, only orders. The body of a slave, male or female, was property, to be used and discarded at the master's whim. Millions of people lived in a state of complete sexual vulnerability. A master could use his slaves for his own pleasure, rent them out to others, or force them into prostitution without any legal consequence. This created a dark undercurrent of resentment and violence that periodically erupted in bloody slave revolts. The sexual exploitation of slaves was not just a side effect of the system, it was a fundamental tool of domination. It constantly reminded the enslaved of their powerlessness and reinforced the master's absolute authority. At the same time, it profoundly corrupted the masters themselves. How could a man who treated human beings as objects in his home be expected to uphold the virtues of respect and restraint in the Senate? The double standard was a poison that seeped into every level of society. While poets wrote odes to idealized love, the slave markets of Rome were filled with human flesh for sale, categorized by age, beauty, and skills. Hetairai, educated courtesans, could wield immense influence, shaping politics and philosophy through their connections with powerful men, yet their freedom was always precarious. A single misstep, a powerful enemy, and they could find themselves cast out, their lives ruined. Could you go against the laws of your time for the sake of love? For the powerful men of Rome, the question was irrelevant. The laws were for others. Their desires, their passions, their whims were what shaped the fate of the world. And as the empire grew more decadent, their passions grew more reckless, accelerating the slide into chaos they claimed to be preventing. The grand edifice of Roman law and order was, in the end, just a crumbling facade hiding a heart of madness. The world was sick with a moral decay, a spiritual emptiness that no amount of conquest or luxury could fill. It was a world desperately searching for a cure, a new truth, a savior. And that savior would arrive from a dusty province in the east, bearing a message so radical, so utterly alien to the Roman worldview, that it would bring the entire ancient world crashing down. From the deserts of Judea, a new story emerged, carried on the whispers of fishermen and artisans. It was a story of a god who was not a lustful patriarch like Jupiter or a capricious warrior like Mars, but a being of pure spirit who demanded not ritual sacrifice, but a revolution of the human heart. This new faith, Christianity, looked at the glittering, decadent world of Rome and saw not a triumph of civilization, but a pit of sin. And the greatest of all sins, the most insidious temptation, was the flesh. Where the pagan world had, in its own complicated way, celebrated the body as a source of pleasure, power, and life, the first Christians saw it as a prison for the soul, a constant battlefield against the forces of demonic lust. The radical shift in consciousness cannot be overstated. Suddenly, the very instincts that had been worshipped as divine for millennia were recast as satanic. The path to salvation no longer lay through appeasing the gods of fertility, but through conquering oneself. This was a declaration of war on human nature itself. The first battlegrounds were the deserts of Egypt and Syria. Men and women known as the Desert Fathers and Mothers fled the corrupt cities to live in caves and isolated huts, seeking to purify their souls through extreme asceticism. They fasted for days, deprived themselves of sleep, and engaged in constant prayer. But their greatest struggle, as their own writings attest, was against the demons of lust. They were haunted by erotic visions, temptations sent by the devil to lure them from the path of righteousness. St. Anthony, one of the most famous, described being tormented by visions of beautiful women, his mind a theatre of forbidden desires. Their heroic struggle against their own bodies became the stuff of legend, inspiring a generation to see pleasure not as a gift, but as a poison. To conquer the world, the new faith first had to convince humanity to conquer itself. Their internal war soon spilled out into the physical world. As Christianity gained influence, its followers began to attack the symbols of the old world. Mobs of zealous monks armed with clubs and torches marched on pagan temples, smashing the statues of Aphrodite and Apollo, seeing them not as works of art, but as idols of debauchery. The great library of Alexandria, a repository of ancient knowledge, was threatened, its scrolls of poetry and philosophy seen as carriers of pagan corruption. It was a cultural revolution fought with fire and stone, an attempt to erase 1,000 years of history and remake the world in a new, purer image. This war on the flesh was not without its own internal conflicts. Not all early Christians agreed on such a total rejection of the body. Various groups, later branded as Gnostics, offered a different path. They believed that salvation came through secret knowledge, or gnosis, and some sects taught that since the body was irrelevant to the soul, its actions were of no consequence. This led to practices that horrified the more orthodox believers. Some Gnostic groups were accused of engaging in ritual orgies, believing that by fully embracing and exhausting the demands of the flesh they could transcend them. They saw the God of the Old Testament, the lawgiver, as a lesser, malevolent deity, and sought a connection to a higher, more abstract spiritual reality. For the emerging church hierarchy, this was the most dangerous heresy of all. It was one thing to fight the pagans, a clear external enemy. It was another to fight a version of Christianity that embraced the very freedom they sought to extinguish. The Gnostics were ruthlessly persecuted, their texts burned, their communities destroyed. The version of Christianity that triumphed was the one that offered the clearest rules and the most rigid control. And the ultimate tool of that control was the imposition of celibacy on its priests. By demanding that its spiritual leaders renounce sex completely, the Church created a class of men set apart from the rest of humanity, supposedly untouched by worldly temptations. This gave them immense moral authority, but it also created a deep internal tension that would haunt the faith for centuries. Celibacy was not just a spiritual discipline, it was a profound political move. It ensured that priests would have no legitimate heirs, preventing the creation of clerical dynasties and ensuring that church property would remain under the central control of Rome. The priest's loyalty was to the church alone, not to a wife or children. The body was now fully subordinate to the institution. The stories of this era are filled with martyrs, particularly female martyrs, who chose gruesome deaths over being forced to marry a pagan official. Their stories were told and retold as heroic tales of spiritual purity triumphing over worldly corruption. They became saints, their rejection of marriage and sexuality celebrated as the highest virtue. A new morality was being born, one founded on denial, fear, and the belief that the path to heaven was paved with the rejection of earthly pleasure. The vibrant, chaotic, and often cruel world of the ancients was being replaced by a new order, one that promised salvation but demanded the subjugation of humanity's most fundamental instinct. The establishment of this new order did not, however, extinguish the fire. It merely drove it underground. The Middle Ages became an era of breathtaking contradiction, a world caught between the lofty ideals of spiritual purity preached from the pulpit and the raw, often brutal, realities of life and lust. The Church held absolute authority over the concept of legitimate sex, confining it strictly within the bonds of marriage. And marriage itself was rarely about love or desire. For the nobility, it was a strategic transaction, a way to forge alliances, merge lands, and secure bloodlines. A noblewoman was a piece of property, her virginity a valuable commodity to be traded by her father for political gain. For the peasantry, it was a practical arrangement for survival, a way to combine labor and produce heirs to work the land. In this world of pragmatic, often loveless unions, a powerful rebellion began to stir, not with swords but with poems and songs. This was the birth of courtly love. Troubadours traveled from castle to castle, singing tales of knights who pledged their undying devotion not to their own wives, but to the unattainable married lady of another lord. This love was not meant to be consummated. It was a spiritual and emotional devotion, a source of noble inspiration. The knight would perform great deeds in his lady's name, wear her colours in tournaments, and worship her from afar. It was a beautiful, romantic ideal, a fantasy of pure love in a world of harsh transactions. But fantasy and reality have a way of blurring. Secret glances in the great hall, a dropped handkerchief, a clandestine meeting in the castle garden, the game of courtly love often tipped over into real, passionate, and incredibly dangerous affairs. The romance of Lancelot and Guinevere, the Queen of King Arthur, was the archetypal story of this conflict. Their forbidden love was portrayed as both beautiful and tragic, a passion so powerful it would ultimately bring down the entire kingdom of Camelot. And so it was in real life. Feudal wars were sparked not just over land disputes, but over accusations of adultery. A husband's honor was inextricably tied to his wife's fidelity, and a proven affair was a stain that could only be washed away with blood. The very idea of romantic love as a basis for marriage, something we take for granted, was a radical, subversive concept born out of this rebellion against a rigid, unfeeling system. In an age that prayed for the soul, the body took its revenge in whispers, poems, and on the battlefield. The monastery was meant to be the fortress of this new spiritual order, a place where men and women could retreat from the temptations of the world and devote their lives to God. It was the epicenter of the war against the flesh. Monks and nuns lived under strict vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their days were a grueling cycle of prayer, labor, and study, designed to leave no room for idle thoughts or worldly desires. Yet even within these sacred walls, the suppressed instincts festered. Chronicles and ecclesiastical court records from the period are filled with stories of secret vices. Forbidden relationships flourished in the shadows of the cloister. Jealousies and passions denied any legitimate outlet, sometimes exploded into violence. Some monasteries became notorious for their lax discipline, their abbots living more like feudal lords than humble servants of God, with fine food, wine, and secret companions. The hypocrisy was not lost on the common people, who were constantly being exhorted to piety by a clergy that sometimes failed to practice what it preached. This tension reveals a fundamental truth about suppression. The harder you push something down, the more powerfully it pushes back, often in distorted and grotesque forms. The ultimate explosion of this suppressed energy came with the Crusades. Tens of thousands of men, from knights to peasants, marched thousands of miles to the Holy Land, fueled by religious fervor and the promise of salvation. They were told they were doing God's work, fighting to reclaim Jerusalem from the infidels. But this holy war was also a journey into a world without rules. Away from their homes, their wives, and the social constraints of their villages, the crusading armies often devolved into undisciplined mobs. The chronicles of the time, from both Christian and Muslim sources, are filled with accounts of mass sexual violence. When a city was captured, the women were considered part of the spoils of war. Rape was not just a byproduct of the conflict, it was a systematic tool of terror and domination. The same knight who might have written a delicate poem to his lady back home could participate in the brutal violation of countless women in a conquered land. This paradox lies at the dark heart of the era, a society that publicly exalted female purity while privately engaging in, and in the context of war, even sanctifying its violation. The deepest anxieties of the age, the fear of chaos, of female power, and of uncontrollable desire, finally coalesced into one terrifying figure: the witch. The witch hunts that began in the late Middle Ages and would escalate into a continent-wide hysteria were, at their core, a war on unsanctioned sexuality. What was a witch accused of? Not just casting spells or souring milk, but of having a fundamentally deviant, predatory sexuality. The Inquisitors' manuals, like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, are obsessed with lurid details of witches' sabbaths, where they were said to engage in orgies with demons and renounce God by kissing the devil's posterior. The witch was the ultimate symbol of female sexuality, untethered from male control. She was the midwife who knew the secrets of contraception and abortion. She was the wise woman whose herbal remedies gave her power over life and death. She was the attractive widow who lived alone and managed her own affairs, a threat to the patriarchal order. An accusation of witchcraft was a powerful weapon. It could be used to settle old scores, to eliminate a rival, or to seize a woman's property. The interrogations, conducted under horrific torture, were designed to produce confessions, and the questions were relentlessly focused on sexual matters. Women were forced to confess to fantastical acts, their own repressed fears and desires twisted into demonic narratives by their tormentors. Thousands upon thousands of women, and some men, were burned at the stake, their agonizing deaths serving as a terrifying public lesson. This was the ultimate consequence of demonizing the flesh. By declaring natural human desires to be the work of the devil, the society created a monster it could then heroically destroy. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy of fear. The shadow of the monastery had grown so long it threatened to blot out the sun. The knight's sword, once a symbol of chivalry, had become an instrument of brutal suppression. The double morality of the Middle Ages had created a world of profound spiritual tension, a society at war with itself. The knight swore allegiance to his lord, but his heart belonged to his lady. If you were in his place, what would be your ultimate guide, your sacred oath, or your forbidden love? Share your choice. Out of this gloom, a new light began to dawn, not from the heavens but from the earth itself. In the city-states of Italy, scholars began unearthing the long-forgotten texts of ancient Greece and Rome. Artists and thinkers began to look at the world around them not as a valley of tears to be endured on the way to the afterlife, but as a place of beauty, wonder, and potential. This was the Renaissance, the rebirth. And at the very center of this rebirth was the human body. After 1,000 years of being hidden under heavy robes, depicted as a wretched vessel of sin, the body was suddenly rediscovered, celebrated, and glorified. Artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci became obsessed with understanding its mechanics, its beauty, its expressive power. They defied church prohibitions and secretly dissected human corpses, peeling back the layers of skin and muscle to understand the machine within. This was a dangerous, sacrilegious act, but it allowed them to create works of breathtaking realism and power. Michelangelo's David is not a humble saint. He is a magnificent, confident physical specimen, a celebration of human potential. Titian's Venus is not a remote goddess, but a warm, inviting woman of flesh and blood, looking directly at the viewer with an unapologetic gaze. This art was a revolution. It declared that the body was not shameful, that human beauty was a reflection of the divine, not its opposite. The Renaissance gave the body back its beauty, and the Inquisition made it pay for that beauty in fire. This new celebration of life and beauty was not confined to the artist's studio. In the bustling, wealthy cities of Rome and Venice, a new kind of woman emerged, the courtesan. These were not common prostitutes. They were educated, witty, and sophisticated women who offered not just physical companionship, but intellectual conversation. They could play musical instruments, write poetry, and debate philosophy. They moved in the highest circles of society, their salons attended by cardinals, ambassadors, and artists. A great courtesan like Veronica Franco in Venice could wield enormous influence, her favor sought by the most powerful men in Europe. They were a living embodiment of the Renaissance's embrace of beauty, pleasure, and intellect. But their position was always perilous. They were admired and desired, but also condemned by the very churchmen who were often their best clients. Their freedom was an affront to the established order, a constant reminder of the hypocrisy that lay at the heart of even this enlightened age. Nowhere was this hypocrisy more blatant, more spectacular than in the Vatican itself. Under the Borgia dynasty at the end of the 15th century, the papacy became a theatre of corruption, nepotism, and ruthless ambition on an unprecedented scale. Pope Alexander VI was not a spiritual leader, but a Machiavellian prince who used his office to enrich his family. He had numerous mistresses and fathered several children, whom he openly acknowledged and promoted to positions of power. His son, Cesare Borgia, a brilliant and utterly ruthless military commander, became the model for Machiavelli's The Prince. His daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, became a legend in her own right, unfairly accused of incest and poisoning, a symbol of female wickedness. While the historical truth of the wildest accusations against her is debated, the atmosphere of the Borgia court is not. It was a place of lavish feasts, political assassinations, and open sexual license. The very heart of Christendom, the institution that demanded celibacy from its priests and condemned pleasure as a sin, was ruled by a family that flouted every one of its own rules. The contrast could not have been more stark. While Michelangelo was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, creating a sublime vision of divine creation, the men who had commissioned him were engaged in the most worldly and sordid of power struggles, using sex and violence as their primary weapons. This flagrant corruption was a major catalyst for the next great upheaval, the Reformation. In Germany, a stubborn monk named Martin Luther, disgusted by the sale of indulgences and the moral decay of the papacy, nailed his 95 Theses to a church door, igniting a firestorm that would split Christendom forever. The Reformation was many things, a theological dispute, a political rebellion, but it was also a puritanical revolt against the perceived depravity of the Catholic Church. The Reformers called for a return to a simpler, purer form of Christianity. They rejected the celibacy of priests, encouraging them to marry and become models of pious family life. They condemned the pagan sensuality of Renaissance art and whitewashed church interiors, smashing statues and stained glass windows. It was a new wave of asceticism, a new war on worldly pleasure, this time directed not against the pagans, but against other Christians. The battle for the soul of Europe was also a battle over the human body. Was it a thing of beauty to be celebrated, or a source of corruption to be disciplined and controlled? This clash between the Renaissance's embrace of the flesh and the Reformation's puritanical backlash created a deeply schizophrenic culture. And in this volatile atmosphere of religious warfare and social anxiety, the witch hunts exploded into their most furious and bloody phase. The 16th and 17th centuries were the apex of the burning times. Europe was ablaze with pyres. The newly invented printing press, which had disseminated the works of humanists and reformers, also spread the inquisitors' manuals and terrifying accounts of witchcraft, fueling a continent-wide paranoia. The slightest suspicion could lead to an accusation, a crop failure, a sick child, a personal grudge. All could be blamed on witchcraft. Women were the primary targets. They were stripped and searched for the devil's mark, a spot on the body insensitive to pain. They were subjected to sleep deprivation, starvation, and unimaginable torture until they confessed and, crucially, named others. It was a self-perpetuating machine of terror. The intellectual breakthroughs of the Renaissance, the study of anatomy, the discovery of new worlds proceeded in parallel with this monstrous regression into superstition and brutality. One could be a brilliant scholar, a man of science and reason, and still believe without question that his neighbor was flying on a broomstick to have sex with the devil. This was the ultimate paradox of an age of genius and madness. It was an era of secret duels fought over courtesans, of artists kidnapping their models for inspiration, and of conspiracies and murders in the perfumed corridors of the papal court. The triumph of beauty and genius played out against a backdrop of unprecedented cruelty, a testament to the fact that intellectual freedom can coexist with the most profound moral darkness. Luxury and vice walked hand in hand down a path paved with both marble statues and human ash. This great cultural war would eventually burn itself out, but not before it gave birth to a new kind of conflict, one fought not with scripture and relics, but with the cold, sharp blade of reason. The religious wars that had torn Europe apart for more than a century left a legacy of exhaustion and a deep skepticism toward dogmatic faith. In the salons of Paris and the coffee houses of London, a new intellectual movement emerged, the Enlightenment. Its guiding principle was reason. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot argued that humanity could improve its condition not through prayer and blind faith, but through logic, scientific inquiry, and education. They championed ideals of liberty, tolerance, and human rights. And inevitably, they turned their critical gaze upon the age-old questions of morality and sexuality. What is the natural way for humans to behave? Are the Church's prohibitions on sexual pleasure rational, or are they merely instruments of social control? This questioning led society to splinter into two radical and opposing extremes. On one side were the libertines. Primarily members of a jaded and fantastically wealthy aristocracy, they rejected all traditional morality as a foolish superstition. For them, the pursuit of pleasure was the only rational goal in life. The royal court at Versailles in France became the epicenter of this philosophy. Life for the nobility was an endless, intricate performance of seduction, intrigue, and adultery. Marriage was a business arrangement. True passion was sought in elaborate, clandestine affairs. This was not just casual promiscuity. For some, it became a rigorous philosophical project. The most infamous and radical of these thinkers was the Marquis de Sade. In his notorious novels, written largely from a prison cell, he argued for absolute freedom, a world in which the individual's desire is the only law. This led him to dark and disturbing conclusions, celebrating cruelty and violence as the ultimate expression of personal liberty. For de Sade, the Enlightenment's liberation of the mind logically required the total liberation of the body from all constraints, moral or legal. The Enlightenment sought to liberate the mind, but in doing so, it unleashed the most elegant and the most brutal monsters of the flesh. On the other side of the Atlantic, another very different experiment in building a new society was underway. In the colonies of New England, the descendants of the Puritans were attempting to create a city upon a hill, a community governed by strict biblical morality. Their world was the polar opposite of the libertine aristocracy of Europe. Here, pleasure was suspect, and discipline was paramount. The community exerted total control over the individual. Church elders could publicly admonish a husband and wife for arguing too loudly. A kiss in public on a Sunday could be punished with a session in the stocks or a public whipping. Adultery was not just a sin, but a capital crime, and while executions were rare, the punishment was severe and public, designed to shame the offender and terrify the community into conformity. This was a society built on the belief that human nature was fundamentally corrupt and had to be relentlessly policed. The family was a rigid hierarchy with the husband as the undisputed master. There was no room for romance or individual desire. Marriage was a duty to God and the community, its purpose to produce and raise pious children. Yet, even in this iron cage of repression, human nature found a way to rebel. Church records are filled with confessions of premarital fornication. The bundling board, a plank placed between a courting couple in bed to prevent physical contact, was a tacit admission that youthful desires could not be entirely extinguished. The famous Salem witch trials of the late 17th century can be seen as an explosion of the repressed sexual anxieties of this rigid society, with teenage girls making hysterical accusations against their neighbors. The Puritan experiment and the libertine philosophy were two sides of the same Enlightenment coin. Both were radical attempts to rationally re-engineer human society, one through total control, the other through total freedom, and both, in their own way, were profoundly inhuman. Could you live in a world of such absolute rules, or would the call of freedom be too strong to ignore? The battle between these two extremes played out not only in salons and meeting houses, but also in the pages of a new and subversive form of literature, the pornographic novel. Works like Fanny Hill in England and the clandestine novels of French libertines were more than just titillating stories. They were acts of political and philosophical protest. They depicted a world where aristocrats and clergymen were corrupt and hypocritical, and where pleasure was a form of rebellion against a repressive social order. They used sex to mock authority and to argue for a more natural, honest approach to human desire. These books were, of course, banned and burned, and their authors and printers risked imprisonment. But they circulated widely in secret, passed from hand to hand, a testament to the public's fascination with the very subjects they were forbidden to discuss. This tension between public repression and private license was a powder keg waiting for a spark. And that spark came at the end of the 18th century with the great revolutions in America and France. The cry for liberty, equality, fraternity was not just a political slogan, it had profound social and sexual implications. The revolution sought to overthrow the old order of kings and priests, and with it, the traditional morality that had supported it. This upheaval was accompanied by an explosion of sexual freedom, but also of sexual violence. The storming of the Bastille and the subsequent reign of terror in France saw political enemies, including Queen Marie Antoinette, being accused of grotesque sexual depravity. The charge of debauchery became a political weapon, a way to dehumanize one's opponents before sending them to the guillotine. The revolution, which had begun with idealistic calls for freedom, descended into a bloodbath, proving that the sudden collapse of an old order, however repressive, does not automatically lead to a better one. It often leads to a terrifying void where the darkest human impulses are unleashed. From the ashes of these revolutions, a new class would rise to power, the bourgeoisie, and they, weary of the excesses of both the aristocracy and the revolutionaries, would attempt to create a new order, one based on hard work, family values, and, above all, an unprecedented level of social and sexual repression. The libertines' wager had failed, and the Puritans' cage was about to be rebuilt, bigger and stronger than ever before. The 19th century arrived, and with it, the ascendancy of the middle class and the reign of Queen Victoria in Great Britain. This era would become so synonymous with sexual repression that its name is now a byword for prudishness. The Victorian paradox was this: it was an age of monumental hypocrisy, an empire that preached the strictest public morality while hiding a world of monstrous private vice. The official ideology centered on the sanctity of the family. The home was to be a refuge from the corrupting influence of the industrial world, and at its heart was the angel in the house, the ideal wife and mother. This woman was expected to be pious, pure, and utterly passionless. Medical experts of the day solemnly declared that respectable women had no sexual feelings whatsoever. Their duty was to endure their husbands' animal urges for the sole purpose of procreation. Female sexuality was seen as a dangerous, disruptive force that had to be completely suppressed. Girls were taught from birth to be modest, to hide their bodies, and to fear their own desires. Any display of passion or intellect was considered unlegitimate and vaguely pathological. This rigid ideal created a society suffocating under the weight of its own denial. The body was a source of shame. Even the legs of a piano were sometimes covered with little trousers, lest they provoke improper thoughts. Language was scrubbed clean of any suggestive words. But this pristine surface was a lie. The harder society tried to repress sexuality, the more it obsessed over it, and the more it festered in the shadows. Beneath the veneer of Victorian respectability lay a vast and thriving underworld. The industrial cities of London and Paris swelled with a poor, desperate population, and prostitution exploded on an unprecedented scale. It is estimated that in London alone there were tens of thousands of prostitutes, ranging from high-class courtesans to destitute streetwalkers, many of them children. This was the dark secret everyone knew, but no one spoke of. The same respectable bourgeois man who demanded absolute purity from his wife might regularly visit a brothel. It was the ultimate double standard. Men's sexual needs were seen as a natural, irresistible force, while women's were denied entirely. This created a stark division of women into two categories: the pure, sexless angel in the house, and the fallen, corrupt prostitute. There was no middle ground. This subterranean world of vice and misery was brutally illuminated in the autumn of 1888 by the terrifying figure of Jack the Ripper. Stalking the dark, foggy streets of London's Whitechapel district, he murdered at least 5 prostitutes, mutilating their bodies with a surgeon's skill. The gruesome crimes created a media sensation and a wave of public panic. But the Ripper was more than just a serial killer. He was a bloody symbol of the era's hypocrisy. His victims were the women society had cast out, the human price of the Victorian family ideal. His rage seemed to be directed at their very sexuality, a violent manifestation of the fear and hatred that lurked beneath the surface of this supposedly civilized society. The killer was never caught, a fact that only amplified the terror. He was a faceless gentleman in a top hat, a phantom who could be anyone, a doctor, a lawyer, even a member of the royal family. As some whispered, he was the monster created by Victorian repression, the walking, stalking embodiment of its darkest secrets. The official response to this world of vice was not to address its root causes, poverty, inequality, the lack of opportunities for women, but to try and police it more rigorously. There were crusades against vice, police raids on brothels, and attempts to rescue fallen women and reform them in punitive institutions. These efforts were largely futile. They only drove the industry deeper underground, making it even more dangerous for the women involved. Yet amid this oppressive atmosphere, the first stirrings of a new revolution were being felt. A few brave women, the first suffragettes and feminists, began to challenge the entire system. They argued that women were not passionless angels, but human beings with their own minds and desires. They began to fight for the right to education, to own property, and most radically of all, for the right to control their own bodies. This included the right to refuse a husband's advances and, though it was barely whispered, the right to contraception. These women were ridiculed, condemned, and ostracized. They were called unnatural, hysterical, and a threat to the very fabric of society. Their struggle was long and arduous, but it was the beginning of the end for the Victorian ideal. The angel in the house was beginning to question the nature of her gilded cage. The Victorian age offered a choice: a respectable life in a gilded cage or a dangerous existence in the shadows of freedom. Which prison would you have chosen? Let us know. The pressure cooker of Victorianism couldn't hold forever. The era's internal contradictions were mirrored on a global scale. The British Empire and other European colonial powers extended their dominion across the globe, exporting not just their technology and their goods, but their rigid sexual morality. They saw the cultures of Africa and Asia as primitive and licentious, and sought to impose their own Christian values upon them. Sexual violence was an implicit and often explicit tool of colonial domination. The colonial master's access to the bodies of native women was a constant assertion of his power and superiority. This created complex and painful legacies of racial and sexual exploitation that would reverberate for generations. At home, the facade of moral certainty was beginning to crack. a series of high-profile scandals exposed the hypocrisy of the elite. None was more spectacular than the trial of Oscar Wilde in 1895. Wilde, a brilliant and celebrated playwright, was publicly prosecuted for gross indecency for his homosexual relationships. His trial became a show trial, a public ritual designed to purge society of a perceived deviant. He was condemned not just for his actions, but for his entire aesthetic philosophy, for his celebration of beauty and pleasure in a world of drab utility. His imprisonment and subsequent ruin served as a brutal warning to anyone who dared to step outside the narrow confines of Victorian convention. The 19th century was an age of steam engines and telegraphs, but in matters of the heart, it was an age of fear. An oppressive, sanctimonious morality hid monstrous vices, creating a society crippled by scandal, class inequality, and a creeping decadence. There was a sense of an ending, a premonition that this rigid, confident, and deeply troubled world was on the brink of a global catastrophe that would shatter its illusions forever. The grand, opulent ball was about to end, and the sound of distant artillery was growing louder. That catastrophe arrived in the summer of 1914. The First World War was a meat grinder that consumed a generation of young men. In the mud and filth of the trenches, the old certainties of God, king, and country died a slow, agonizing death. The war shattered not just empires, but the very moral framework of the 19th century. For the millions of men who survived, the world they returned to was unrecognizable, and they themselves were irrevocably changed, physically and psychologic crutches, forever haunted by what they had seen and done. The old ideals of chivalry and honor seemed like a sick joke after the industrial-scale slaughter of Verdun and the Somme. For the women left behind on the home front, the war brought a different kind of revolution. With the men away fighting, they flooded into factories and offices, taking on roles they had been told for centuries they were incapable of. They earned their own money, lived on their own, and discovered a new sense of independence and competence. When the war ended, they were not willing to simply go back to being angels in the house. The delicate, fainting Victorian lady was replaced by a new icon, the flapper. With her short bobbed hair, her knee-length skirts, and her liberated attitude, she was the embodiment of the new era. She smoked, she drank, she danced the Charleston in jazz clubs, and she openly embraced a sexuality that her mother's generation would have found horrifying. The 1920s roared with a kind of desperate, feverish gaiety. It was the frantic energy of a generation that had stared into the abyss and was determined to live for the moment, to forget the trauma of the war in a whirlwind of parties, illegal alcohol, and free love. This was not just a change in fashion, it was a fundamental shift in morality, a conscious rejection of the stifling world that had led them into the slaughter. The car became a private space for courting couples. The cinema offered tantalizing glimpses of a more glamorous and sexually liberated world, and a new, syncopated music called jazz provided the soundtrack for a generation cutting loose. The 20th century began with a gunshot, and its echo shattered not just empires, but the very beds in which they were conceived. While this social revolution was happening on the dance floors, an intellectual revolution was exploding from a quiet doctor's office in Vienna. Sigmund Freud's theories of psychoanalysis were a bombshell dropped into the heart of post-Victorian society. His central, shocking claim was that human beings are not rational creatures, but are driven by powerful, unconscious desires, most of them sexual in nature. He introduced concepts like the Oedipus complex, penis envy, and libido, arguing that our deepest anxieties, our dreams, our slips of the tongue, all stem from repressed sexual conflicts that originate in childhood. For a society that had spent a century trying to pretend sex didn't exist, this was scandalous. Freud was denounced as a pervert, a charlatan, a madman who saw sex in everything. But his ideas were also thrillingly subversive. They offered a scientific-sounding explanation for the turmoil that people felt but could not articulate. Psychoanalysis became fashionable, a parlor game for the sophisticated, a new kind of confession for a secular age. The idea that it's all about sex, seeped into the popular consciousness, permanently changing the way we think and talk about ourselves. What Freud did was give the 20th century a new language for desire. He ripped the curtain of Victorian denial away, revealing a messy, complex, and often dark inner world. He argued that civilization itself is built upon the repression of our primal instincts, a fragile truce in a permanent war between our desires and the demands of society. He didn't offer a cure, only a diagnosis, and that diagnosis was profoundly unsettling. The monster was not outside the gates, it was within us all. This new fascination with the inner self, combined with the trauma of the war, created a fertile ground for the rise of new, radical political ideologies. Totalitarian movements like fascism and communism promised to heal the fractured modern world and create a new, powerful, and unified society. And both, in their own ways, sought to seize control of sexuality and subordinate it to the needs of the state. The Nazis in Germany promoted a cult of the healthy, Aryan body, encouraging racially pure women to have more children for the Reich while systematically sterilizing or murdering those they deemed unfit. The Soviet Union initially flirted with free love after the revolution, but quickly reversed course, promoting a puritanical morality that saw sex as a distraction from the duty of building socialism. Both ideologies understood what Hammurabi had understood millennia before. To control a people completely, you must first control their most intimate lives. The wild parties of the Roaring Twenties were coming to an end, and the shadow of a new, even more terrible war was looming. The Second World War completed the demolition job the First had begun. It was a global conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality, culminating in the Holocaust and the atomic bomb, events that forced humanity to confront the depths of its own capacity for evil. In the aftermath, the world was exhausted, shell-shocked, and divided. A new Cold War began, pitting the capitalist West against the communist East. In the United States of America, the post-war era saw a return to a more conservative social climate. The 1950s were an age of conformity, characterized by suburban tract housing, grey flannel suits, and a renewed emphasis on the traditional nuclear family. The rebellious flapper was replaced by the happy homemaker. But beneath this placid surface, the forces of change were gathering. A quiet revolution was taking place in scientific laboratories. For years, researchers had been working on a seemingly simple idea, a pill that could reliably prevent pregnancy. In 1960, the first oral contraceptive, Enovid, was approved for use in the United States. Its arrival was not met with fanfares and parades. It was a quiet, almost unnoticed event, but the pill would prove to be more revolutionary than any bomb. For the first time in human history, it decisively and reliably separated sex from procreation. It gave women a degree of control over their own reproductive lives that had previously been unimaginable. A revolution doesn't always start with a manifesto. Sometimes it starts with a small pill. The full impact of this tiny pill took a few years to be felt, but when it combined with the demographic bulge of the baby boom generation coming of age and the growing social unrest of the 1960s, it created a perfect storm. Young people began to question everything about the society they had inherited: the war in Vietnam, racial inequality, consumerism, and, most explosively, the rigid sexual morality of their parents. A counterculture was born. Hippies with long hair and colorful clothes preached a message of peace, love, and spiritual exploration. Their slogan, "Make love, not war," was a direct challenge to the establishment. They rejected the monogamous, marriage-oriented model of their parents in favor of communal living and sexual freedom. Events like the Summer of Love in San Francisco in 1967 and the Woodstock Festival in 1969 became legendary symbols of this new ethos. It was a euphoric, often naive attempt to create a new kind of society based on cooperation and pleasure rather than competition and repression. This cultural rebellion soon spilled over into political action. The civil rights movement's fight for racial equality inspired other groups to demand their own liberation. The women's liberation movement, or second-wave feminism, gained momentum, arguing that the personal was political. They fought for equal pay, access to education, and an end to gender discrimination, but at the heart of their struggle was the fight for reproductive freedom. The battle for the legalization of abortion became one of the most divisive and fiercely fought political struggles of the era. On one side were those who believed a woman had an absolute right to control her own body. On the other were those who believed abortion was murder. The landmark 1973 Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade, which established a woman's constitutional right to an abortion, was a major victory for the feminist movement, but it did not end the conflict. Instead, it escalated it, creating a culture war that continues to this day. Simultaneously, another liberation movement was finding its voice. For centuries, gay and lesbian people had lived in the shadows, their love condemned as a sin, a crime, and a mental illness. They faced social ostracism, police harassment, and the constant threat of violence. In the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, the patrons of a gay bar in New York City called the Stonewall Inn decided they had had enough. When the police conducted one of their routine raids, the customers fought back. The ensuing riots lasted for several nights and are now seen as the single most important event in the gay rights movement. Stonewall was a declaration that they would no longer hide in fear. It sparked the creation of activist groups and the first pride parades, beginning the long, hard fight for visibility, acceptance, and equal rights. The sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s was not one single event, but a series of interconnected explosions. It was a time of student protests clashing with police on college campuses, of massive marches on Washington, of fierce debates on television, and of deeply personal struggles in millions of bedrooms and kitchens. It was a time of immense hope and a feeling that anything was possible, that the old world was crumbling and a new, freer one was being born. But this explosion of freedom inevitably created a powerful backlash. A conservative counter-revolution began to organize, vowing to restore traditional values and roll back the changes that had shaken the nation to its core. The battle lines were drawn for a new kind of conflict, one that would define the political and cultural landscape for the rest of the century and beyond. The gains of the sexual revolution were profound, but they were not without a price. The new freedom brought new anxieties. The rise of sexually transmitted diseases culminating in the terrifying AIDS epidemic of the 1980s brought a new sense of fear and caution. The party seemed to be over and the era was marked by a more somber mood, but the changes that had been set in motion were irreversible. The revolution, however, was about to be transformed by a force that no one saw coming. In laboratories and university basements, another technology was being developed, one that would reshape human society as profoundly as the printing press or the steam engine. It was a global network of interconnected computers, the Internet. In its early days, the Internet was the domain of academics and hobbyists, but with the invention of the World Wide Web in the early 1990s, it exploded into public consciousness. Suddenly, with a computer and a modem, anyone could access a vast global library of information and communicate with people all over the world. And one of the very first things humanity used this incredible new tool for was to look at pictures of naked people. The rise of online pornography was staggering. It moved from the fringe to the mainstream, accessible with a click of a mouse in the privacy of one's own home. This had a massive and still not fully understood impact on the mass consciousness. It changed expectations, shaped desires, and created new anxieties. For some, it was a liberating source of information and exploration. For others, it was a corrupting influence, a source of addiction, and a driver of the brutal exploitation of women and men in the pornography industry. We spent millennia building walls to hide our desires. The Internet gave us a key to every door, only to reveal we were living in a house of mirrors. The digital revolution didn't stop there. It fundamentally rewired the ways we meet, date, and form relationships. Newspapers' personal ads gave way to online dating sites, which then evolved into smartphone apps. The slow, uncertain ritual of courtship was replaced by the instantaneous logic of the swipe. With apps like Tinder, potential partners became a deck of cards to be sorted through, evaluated and accepted or rejected in a fraction of a second. This created a world of unprecedented choice and connection but also one of potential alienation and disposability. Social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter became the new public square, where we curated idealized versions of our lives and loves for public consumption. Our most intimate moments were now performative, subject to the judgment of likes and comments. Privacy, a concept so cherished by previous generations, began to seem like a quaint, outdated notion. This new digital world has created new frontiers of identity and conflict. The internet has allowed once marginalized communities to find each other, to build solidarity, and to advocate for their rights on a global scale. The fight for the rights of transgender people has moved from the fringes to the center of a raging culture war, forcing society to confront its most basic assumptions about gender and identity. Activism has also found a powerful new voice online. The Me Too movement, sparked by a simple hashtag, became a global tidal wave. It was a collective roar of anger from millions of women and some men who shared their stories of sexual assault and harassment, exposing the systemic nature of the problem in nearly every industry and institution. It toppled powerful men and forced a long overdue public reckoning with the abuse of power. Yet, this same technology that can be a tool for liberation can also be a weapon of unprecedented cruelty. The anonymity of the internet has unleashed new forms of harassment and abuse. Cyberbullying, revenge porn, the non-consensual sharing of intimate images, and doxing have become terrifyingly common tactics used to silence and intimidate, particularly women. Our digital lives have made us vulnerable in ways we are only beginning to understand. Hacker attacks can expose our most private messages and photos to the world. A careless post can ruin a career. We are living in an age of total transparency, whether we choose to or not. The race between technology and morality is always on, and morality is always, it seems, several laps behind. We have traveled from sacred rituals by a flickering fire to the cool blue glow of a smartphone screen. We have seen sexuality worshipped as a god, condemned as a demon, treated as a commodity, and medicalized as a psychological condition. It seems that all the old prohibitions have been lifted, all the ancient secrets revealed. We have more freedom, more information, and more ways to connect than any previous generation in human history. But have we become freer, or have we simply swapped one set of chains for another, more subtle and insidious one? In this new world of total access, where every desire can be catalogued and every preference turned into an algorithm, have we become the masters of our passion, or merely its most distracted consumers? Write in the comments what you think we have truly gained: ultimate freedom or ultimate distraction.